Good morning, everybody. What I'd like to offer in this session, we've only got a very short period of time, so we're going to move fairly quickly, is a thought leadership piece around how we manage risk in programs, which is different from managing risk in projects. Risk Doctor and Partners is a small global risk consultancy specializing in risk management, not just in projects and programs, but also strategic and corporate, reputation, environmental, fraud, counter-terrorism, all kinds of risk, and we work in every continent except the Antarctic, far too cold. But we have wide experience in risk management, and in this setting, we've been very involved with the various standards written by the PMI, Project Management Institute, and also the APM, Association for Project Management. So I'm drawing on some work that we've done in those particular forums. So what we're going to cover is the difference between projects and programs. Hopefully you'll be aware of that. The difference between projects and program risk, and then leading from those things into the difference between the way that we manage risk in projects and programs and how those things ought to be different. In AIM, what we're trying to do in the area in which we're looking for risks and how to manage them, and in the approach that we adopt. And it's not completely defined, this whole area of program risk management. There's some good practice, not necessarily best practice, but some emerging practice, perhaps we should say. And so what I want to do is just suggest at the very end some remaining challenges, some things that we need to think about if we're going to make this work in practice. So that's the outline. So program management itself is something of a hot topic. It's been something we've been thinking about for quite a long time. Starting way back in the early 90s with the old CCTA, and they had a project and program management library. And in that library, they included some guidelines on how we ought to be managing programs as distinct from projects. So this is 20 years ago we've been started to think about this. The old OGC, which has now been absorbed into something else, started publishing its guidelines on managing successful programs, I guess probably, again, 10 years ago. We're now just recently up to the 4th edition of Managing Successful Programs as their guidelines. So that's been going for a while. In the APM body of knowledge, in the 5th edition, which I think was 2006, program management was a knowledge area. Now, in the 6th edition, published last year, program management is fully integrated into the whole body of knowledge. So you'll find for each of those knowledge areas, there are levels of implementation at project, then program, then portfolio level. So we're beginning to see this becoming much more integrated. The PMI, the Project Management Institute, has a program manager's professional certification, which has been going for 5 or 6 years. So you see these things are quite widely accepted, and there is in PMI a standard for program management, which is now in its 3rd edition. So there's quite widespread understanding that programs exist, that programs are important, they need to be managed, and they need to be managed in a way that's different from the way we address projects. The problem is that there's no real consensus. So if we looked at these different sort of bodies, the OGC, APM, PMI, and others, there isn't really any great agreement on what a program is even, how it ought to be managed, and in particular, some of the more detailed areas of managing things like risks in programs. So if we look for definitions, and we'll see there are some common themes, but perhaps not entirely the same. In PMI, a program, which of course they spelled wrong, but that's because the PMI is based in the States. We can't even agree how to spell the thing, so let alone what it actually is. A group of related projects, but programs may also include other things, elements of related work, whatever that may be. The APM also talks about a group of related projects, but which may include related business as usual activities. So again, things which are outside of just a bunch of projects put together. And the OGC says that it's actually an organizational structure. A program is a way of organizing yourself, which includes related projects and other activities. So we've got some sort of convergence, but not a single definition of what a program is. The one thing that's clear is that a program is not a project, that these things are completely different in nature, because programs are made up of projects, but a program is not a project. A program sits above a project, so it clearly is something different in nature, which means that program management needs to be something different. For PMI, program management is coordinated management of a program. That doesn't really tell you very much, except that the reason for doing program management is to achieve strategic objectives and benefits. Strategic objectives and benefits. That word appears in the APM definition as well. It's about managing related projects and other activities together in a coordinated way in order to achieve a beneficial change of a strategic nature. So we're now at this sort of next level up, and OGC says the same sort of thing, that it's doing something in a coordinated way to achieve outcomes and benefits of strategic importance. So whereas projects are more tactical, projects are about creating deliverables and creating capability, programs are about strategy, are about creating strategic benefits and strategic value. So there's a different level here. And when we come to risk management, now we begin to get a little bit interesting to see how would we manage risk in programs. Clearly programs are risky, and that's a good thing because risk offers us opportunities to innovate and be creative. Risk offers us the opportunity to do things differently in a way that hasn't been done before. So risk includes opportunities as well as threats, as we know. So because programs are risky, then we need to manage that risk. The question is how. And what PMI and APM started out by suggesting was that program risk management was project risk management, just done on a bigger scale. So the very first edition of the PMI's program management standard just took the PMBOK, the Project Management Body of Knowledge Risk Chapter, which was Chapter 11, which is a joke in America, incidentally. Risk management is Chapter 11. If you've ever worked in America, you'll understand. That's an in-joke. But what PMI did was to take the project risk management process and do a global replace, project for program, and then say, well, we'll just do the same thing, but for programs. I'm not sure that's going to work. And so I'd like to suggest that actually program risk management needs to be different. It needs to be aiming at something different and having a different scope from the way that we do project risk management. It needs to have a different approach because programs are strategic in nature, whereas projects are tactical and deliverable focused. And we might need different tools and techniques as well. So what I'd like to do is to focus the next 20 minutes or so around those areas. We won't particularly get into tools and techniques because we don't have time, but particularly on the questions of aim, scope, and approach, just to suggest to you ways in which the program level of managing risk might be different from, complementary to, but different from the project level. And so what we'll say is if a program is not a project and program management is not project management, then program risk management is not project risk management. That's my basic thesis in one simple sentence. And hopefully there'll be some time for questions towards the end. So aim and scope. Let's start with aim and scope. What is program risk management trying to do? We could simply say it's managing risks at the program level. Here's a definition of risk. It comes from the PMI PMBOK. It's also matched by definitions, equivalent definitions from APM, OGC, and also the ISO standard, ISO 31000. We might say in general terms that risk is an uncertainty that matters. That's my kind of way of simplifying this statement. Uncertainty that matters, it's an uncertain event or condition, something that either will or won't happen, or a group of things coming together which are characterized by uncertainty. But not just any uncertainty, it's an uncertainty that matters because if it happens, it has an effect on one or more of our objectives. And incidentally, you'll just notice these three words, positive or negative. We won't particularly talk about that now, but it is best practice, common practice to recognize that risk includes upside as well as downside. So there are uncertainties that matter because they can help us, as well as uncertainties that matter because they can hinder us. And both of those things are in scope for risk management. That's not the point of this particular session. But risk is an uncertainty that if it occurs, affects our objectives. Now, you'll notice these X's, and we can replace those X's, because we have different levels of objectives in our organizations, we can replace this with something that describes different types of objectives in order to identify different types of risk. So, for example, we might say that a project risk is any uncertainty that if it occurs affects project objectives. And we might say that a strategic risk is any uncertainty that affects strategic objectives. In fact, for us as individuals, personal risks are uncertainties that affect our personal objectives, to be happy, healthy, wealthy, and wise, or whatever your objectives happen to be. So we can quite simply just take this little word here and replace it with the word program and say that a risk at program level is defined as any uncertainty, whether it's an event or a condition, that if it does happen, will affect, in a positive or negative way, our ability to achieve our program objectives. Quite simple. Uncertainty that affects program objectives. So that's the aim, to manage those things. And what's in scope is any risk that can affect achievement of any program objective. Quite simple and quite straightforward. But different from projects, because projects are tactical and deliverable focused, whereas programs are strategic and benefits focused. Okay, so we're doing the same sort of thing, at least the aim is, and scope is the same, but at a different level. So that's quite simple, except that programs, because they sit above projects, have a different sort of type of risk which they're exposed to. Because programs sit between projects and strategy, so they sit in the middle of two things, which means that risks come at programs from a number of different directions. Risks come up at them from below, risks comes down at them from above, and risks come at them from the same level. So just to illustrate that in a picture, here are our programs which connect projects and strategy. Actually, not just projects, but other related activities, you'll remember from those definitions. So we've got programs which are made up of a set of components, related projects and other activities. These form our programs, and the programs are used to deliver strategic benefits. What that means is that if we sit at program level, we're exposed to uncertainties from a range of different directions. So we have uncertainties, risks which are escalated or aggregated from below. So things which are down here at our project level or our business as usual level or our other activities level, which are so big or so important that they have an impact and need to be managed at program level. So we need to escalate our risks from below to the program level. We also have risks which come at us from above, risks which originate in the strategic level, things that happen in the boardroom or in the senior management or in our policy setting forums, which will have an effect on our programs because we're trying to deliver strategic benefits to the organization, so anything that happens at strategic level matters to our programs. And then we have program level risks which come at us from the level of the program itself. Now this in itself tells you that program risk management is different from project risk management because you don't have that same sort of multiplicity of sources at the project level. Projects sit down here and everything comes at you from above or from the project level. So here what we've got is a different concept because of the positioning of programs between projects and strategy. Does that make sense? Non-verbal is okay? Okay, because this is the kind of the basis of where I want to go with this. There are three sources of risk that we need to think about. So, for example, risks come at us at the program level from below. We're wandering along with our programs, we think everything is perfectly fine, and then you turn around and you say, well, what happened? And it's because we took some risk from down below, which we, don't worry, this is only Photoshop, by the way. But, you know, doesn't that happen on your programs? You think everything's fine, here's all of your little projects following along behind you, and you turn around as the program manager and you say, where did they go? I've got one left, but, you know, that was it. And sometimes it's not as sort of passive as just walking across something. Often there's something aggressive which comes up and bites you, which you really weren't expecting from the lower level. So the question is, how do we deal with those at the program level? So we've got four particular sources of risks which come to us at the program level from our projects and from our related components which form the program. So clearly we've got at the project level big project risks. Risks which are so big within a component project that they have an impact at program level or they need to be managed at program level. So we have big, large project risks which need to be escalated to the program level because their impact is bigger than just the project. We also have the possibility of a number of related risks at project level which when you add them together, they have an impact which is so big that it needs to be managed at the program level. We call this aggregation, escalation and aggregation. Those are the two ways that risks come up to us at program level from our projects. Then we have the risk of a component project itself failing. This is not the risk within a project, this is the risk of a project itself, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. We call this overall project risk. It's different from individual project risks. You might think that risks and risk are the same thing, but they're not. If you think at project level and you try to answer the question, how risky is my project? The answer to the question, how risky is my project, is not a list of risks. There's something else, there's some other characteristic, which is the overall riskiness of the project, which is different from a list of individual risks. And you'll find these concepts, individual risks and overall risk, defined both in the APM body of knowledge and in the PMI, PMBOK and the PMI practice standard for risk, and in the ISO standard. They're different levels of risk exposure. And so we might have not just big or grouping together individual risks within a component project, but we might have the risk of the project itself failing within our overall program. The project itself can pose a risk at program level. And these are about projects, but we'll remember that programs include non-project components, business as usual and other activities. So clearly we can have escalated or aggregated risks from within those components as well. So what we've got is a whole range of things happening, bubbling underneath the surface below the program level at the project and component level, which could have an impact higher up. And so we're exposed to things that are happening within our program, which are not at the program management level, but they're in the project and component level, which could have an effect and need to be managed at program level. So what we need to do in order to understand which of these risks that are down here need to be managed at program level is that we need to know what is the threshold of risk between the project level and the program level. So where are risks sufficiently small? I've put this word large in inverted commas. Where is the risk just a small risk and it belongs at the project level or at the component level and can be managed down there? And where does it come up for attention to program level? There's going to be some risk threshold which is crossed when we go, that's a project level, oh no, this is a program risk. And there are two reasons, two ways of defining this threshold. One is attention and the other is action. What do I need to know about and what do I need to do something about at program level? If it breaches either the attention or action threshold, then it needs to be managed as a program risk. So the first thing we need to know is where is that threshold, and that will be different for different organizations. It will be different for different programs, but we need to know if we're going to manage risk at the program level so we know what's going to be escalated. We also need to know how do we decide how big a risk is? Are we going to use red, yellow, green? Are we going to use 1 to 10 or 1 to 100? What scale are we going to use? We need some way of doing this consistently across all of our projects and components of the program so we can compare apples with apples. Because if you're on a tiny little project and you think this risk is massive for my project, actually at the program level it might be insignificant. Similarly, if we have a very large component project and you have a sort of a medium or small risk, actually a medium or small risk on a very big project could still be significant at program level. So we've got to have some way of sizing risks consistently. And those are challenges for us as we look to manage risk at program level. Where is the threshold between projects and programs, and how do we size risks across the components of our program in a consistent way? I'm not sure we actually know how to do this very well, but we need to be able to do it if we're going to implement this. So if we wanted to draw those four sources as a picture, first thing we need to know is how do we size our risks? So what are the units in this vertical scale? You might use, for example, expected monetary value. You might monetize all of your risks in some utils, where utils are like pounds or dollars or euros, but they're non-denominational. You might use some risk score, some way of multiplying probability and impact with impact for different types of objective. So there are different ways of sizing risks, and then we need to know what this threshold is. Below the threshold, project attention and action. Above the threshold, program attention and action. But once we know those things, we can do this kind of chart. So now we plot all the risks in the project risk register. Anything which is small, remains below the threshold, needs to be managed at project level. Fine, there'll be a lot of those. But there might be risks which are big. So their size on this vertical axis breaches this threshold. They are large project risks, risks within a project or another component, which are so big that they breach the threshold, so they're escalated to program level. And then we might have a group of risks which individually, they don't particularly breach the threshold on their own, but they're related because they come from the same area, and so when we add them together they breach the threshold. So these ones are not to be escalated, they are aggregated, they relate together, and so we put them together, and then at program level we recognize they need to be managed at the higher level. Now, this is an interesting word, related. How do we relate? How do we know project risks are related? One of the great tools that we use at the project level is the breakdown structure. And in projects, we have a range of breakdown structures which we can use to decide whether risks are related or not. So, for example, we could relate them by where they come from. That's the risk breakdown structure, which talks about the source of risk. We can relate risks by where they might hit the project, so the effect of the risk, which would be the work breakdown structure. We could talk about different types of impact, the RIBS, the risk impact breakdown structure, the cost breakdown structure, the organizational breakdown structure, the product breakdown structure. All of these different breakdown structures that we use, we can map our risks against those breakdown structures and then relate them together and look for common groupings, look for patterns. So where we find a whole set of risks which affect the same work package, for example, or a related work package across all of our programs, all of our projects, or which come from the same source within the risk breakdown structure, then we add them together and we see if added together they breach the threshold. So this, I think, is reasonably straightforward to understand. There are small risks managed at project level, there are big risks which need to be escalated to program level, and there are related risks which, when we add them together, are sufficiently significant to need program level attention and action. Happy with that? Okay, that's our first source. So if we drew that in the picture, the white ones are the ones that stay down at component level. The yellow ones are the ones, these red and yellow ones are the ones that need to be escalated and aggregated. And of course, in principle, you might find some risks at component level, at project level, which are so big, which they breach not only the program level, but they need attention right at the top of the tree in terms of board level attention or senior management team. So, this principle applies right across the board as long as we know these thresholds and as long as we know how to size our risks in a consistent way. Okay, so that's risks that come up at our programs from down below. There are also risks which we're exposed to from those who stand above us, who are supposed to protect us and guide us and lead us and do all those good things. And of course, sometimes they don't do that, and sometimes we find things are dropped on us from a great height and it becomes very uncomfortable down below. So what risks are we exposed to from above? Here we're talking about risks which originate in the strategic level, and because programs exist to create strategic benefits, to deliver strategic benefits into an organization, then we have to recognize that there are things that happen at the strategic level that, if they occur, will affect our program objectives or require program level action. So again, attention and action. Things which come from policy, things which come from the positioning of the organization, from the way that we set ourselves up competitively, from issues to do with our prioritization and so on. And a number of these things can affect our programs if the company changes direction or changes policy. Again, in order to implement that, we need to know what this strategy to program risk threshold is. At what point will the boss say, I don't care about that, that's your job, you manage it? And where will the boss say, why didn't you tell me? You should have mentioned that to me. I need to know about that. What is the board interested in, or your senior management team? At what level does a risk require their attention and action? We need to know that, and in the same way be able to size our risks. And it also means we have got to have clear communication channels when we're talking to the board about risks which affect our programs. We need to be honest about these things. Honesty is not the best policy. Honesty is the only policy, because risk needs to be managed. And if we're hiding risks at program level, then we're not doing a good job. We need to get these things exposed on the table so that we can manage them. And we also need to make sure that we're delegating, especially when risks come down to us from above, the risks are delegated for attention and action, but we don't abdicate all responsibility. It's still my risk. So that's the risks that strike us from above. Then we've got risks which come at us on the same level, and very often we're not looking in the right direction, so we don't see the risks that we're exposed to, and then suddenly it just kind of strikes you and you think, well, where did that come from? Here we're talking about risks which can affect the program itself from program. So they don't originate from the projects or the components from below. They don't originate from senior management and strategy and policy from above. They are to do with the program itself. And this is the area where I think most of us who are working in programs are comfortable. We're familiar with the idea that we have to manage program risks, and often we forget about the above and below. So what sort of things arise from program level? First of all, we have to say both threats and opportunities. There are good risks as well as bad risks at program level, so we need to be alert to the uncertainties that will save time, save money, enhance benefits, help us work faster, smarter, cheaper, all of those things, as well as the things that will slow us down and damage reputation and destroy value and so on. But at the program level, there's a range of different things. They come from the whole range of sources within our risk breakdown structure, just like project risks, so we can look in the same kind of places. But there are two main groups of risks which programs are particularly exposed to at the program level, which are not project risks and are not strategic risks. So one set is to do with interfaces. Clearly, a program is made up of a whole range of components, related projects and other things. So anything to do with interfaces between those components could pose a risk, either a threat or an opportunity for our project. So things to do with prioritizing our projects, or the use of common resources and so on, dependencies and common technology. All of those sorts of things, and I guess we're quite tuned into that if we're managing at the program level. We tend to think about those things. The other is things that affect the program as a whole. So this is interfaces between our components. This is whole program risks to do with executing and managing the program itself. So what happens in terms of our ability to control the program, to report the program, to understand how it relates to strategic imperatives, changes in client or company requirements, and so on. So these sorts of things, and again, I think we're probably quite used to those. So what we've got is these three different sources of risk at the program level, which I think are different in nature, makes management of risk at the program level different in nature from the way we deal with risk in projects. Project risk management is much simpler. Here we've got a much bigger group of things to think about in terms of the scope of the risks that can affect us in our programs. So if we think about scope, it's much more complex because we've got a number of different levels to think about, which means that we need a different approach. In project risk management, it's easy. We've got a process. You set your objectives, you identify the risks, you assess and prioritize them, you might do some quantitative analysis, you develop some responses which you implement, you see if it works, and you review and update and communicate, report, and then you do it again. That's not going to work for this kind of complexity. We need to do something different. What I'd like to suggest here is that your program risk management approach needs to have two completely different sort of structures, two different strategies. And here we're coming back to this idea of risk and risks. Because risk relates to the way that we structure our program, risks relates to the things that happen within it. And so we need to manage them in a different way. I'd like to use these words, implicit and explicit, to describe ways in which we might manage the overall program risk and the individual risks which sit within the program. And here, this includes risks that come up at you from below, escalated and aggregated, and the risks that are delegated from above, from the strategic level. And this tends to be the program level risks. So what do I mean by implicit and explicit? Implicit program risk management is to do with the way that we structure the program. The structure of the program embodies a level of risk. It kind of bakes in or builds in a level of risk because of the way the program is structured. That means that actually we could change the risk exposure of the overall program by changing the structure of the program itself. So the content and the context, the structure and the scope of the program will affect the overall exposure of risk within that program. So what we could do is actually change our components. We could build our program in order to have a risk-efficient program. Now this is a jargon term. I don't know if you're familiar with the idea. Risk efficiency was developed by a man called Harry Markowitz in 1957, would you believe? He has a theory called modern portfolio theory, modern in 1957, so it's not very modern now. But it was to do with building financial portfolios where we could maximize our level of return. And he came up with this idea of risk efficiency in a financial portfolio of investments to say that we want to have in our portfolio some low risk, low return bread and butter investments where we'll just kind of get a safe return. We also ought to have some high risk, high return elements in our portfolio where we're taking a chance. We could lose everything, but we could win really big. And we need to understand that we need to have a balance of risk and reward across our portfolio in order to have an optimized financial investment portfolio. Now, actually, the same is exactly true for programs. In our program of projects, what we ought to do when we're thinking about this overall risk exposure of the program is to build a risk-balanced or risk-efficient portfolio of projects and other activities within our program. So we need to have some small, safe projects that aren't going to blow up, that just do what they're going to do, and they're not very exciting, but they're safe. They give us a return. And then there'll be some where we're just taking a bit of a punt. And senior management know we could really make some big bucks here, or actually it could all go horribly wrong. And that's okay within the overall risk balance of the portfolio, and so on. So what we need to do in terms of affecting the overall program risk exposure is to build the program intentionally, deliberately, with this concept of risk efficiency in mind, where we're thinking about that risk-reward balance and seeking to build a risk-balanced portfolio where we get the required return in terms of strategic benefits against an acceptable level of risk. Now that's, again, a challenge. It's I guess, a new concept for quite a lot of us. It makes sense when you understand what we're trying to do. The question is, how? How am I going to do that? What we need is to understand how much risk the organization can take, and we need to be able to evaluate the risk exposure of each program component on a consistent basis. You'll recognize these are the same two challenges that we had earlier on in terms of understanding, even identifying and managing risks within the project. We have the same two challenges at this overall risk exposure level as well. So this is, there are some interesting issues, some interesting commonalities coming out here in terms of the things we need to think about. And what we're trying to do then is review the overall level of program risk exposure during the life cycle, during the execution of the program, and then change it by changing the mix of components within our program in order to stay below our risk acceptability threshold. So how much risk is acceptable on our program? How much risk have we got with each of our individual components? As we go through, if the risk exposure breaches our threshold and the program becomes overexposed, let's do something different. Let's kill some projects. Let's take on some more safe projects. Let's change the risk-efficient mix of our program so that we stay within our risk acceptability threshold. Okay, is that making sense? So risk efficiency is a key driver for this managing this overall program risk. And what we're doing is we're thinking about the inherent structure of our program. Then we need to think about having built our program in a way that maximizes the return for a given level of risk, which is the definition of risk efficiency. Then we need to execute our program to stay within that. And clearly the way that we manage our program, actual program management itself, is a risk management strategy. It's the same in project management. If you know about project management, every project management discipline actually is designed to manage some kind of uncertainty. So in project management, we do scope definition, a work breakdown structure, for example, in order to manage scope uncertainty. So you know what's in the project and what's not. We do estimating in order to manage cost uncertainty. We do scheduling in order to manage time uncertainty. That's what we're doing. And the same is true at program level. So the way that we actually manage the program is designed to manage uncertainty within that program. For example, breaking our program up into chunks or tranches and then delivering incrementally. The reason we do that is to reduce the overall exposure of the main program itself. And again, there's a project parallel in terms of agile and lean and so on, in terms of those small sprints and chunks and doing the most risky ones first. We're doing the same thing here. Then once we've built these chunks or tranches, we decouple them in the program. This is just standard program management. The phrase that's used, I think it's in the MSP guideline, is islands of stability. I love that phrase. I wish I had a few more of those in my life. But the idea that as the program is, volatile and changing and emergent and all those sort of things that happen in our programs, because we've been able to split out our program into areas of delivery, some of those areas will be safe. And those ones we know we can deliver at low risk, creating value and strategic benefits. So there are some tranches. This is the way we get that kind of bottom end of the risk-efficient equation. And then recognizing that our program is cyclic, that gives us an opportunity at these different review points: plan, execute, deliver, review, plan, and then do another tranche. Execute, deliver, review, plan another tranche, and then we're off again. At each of these review and planning points, we have the opportunity to change the component mix in order to address the overall program risk exposure. Okay? I hope this is making sense to you. So what we're doing is, within the program, within the way that we manage the program, we have built-in flexibility and resilience. That means there are points in the program built into the overall management of the program where we design flexibility in, where we know we can make a change if we need to. We can change the mix of components, we can change the level of risk of our different components, we can affect the overall risk-efficient balance, and overall, based on the structure of the program, change the risk exposure of the whole thing. And then because we've got these tranches, then we're resilient to change because some of these things are decoupled. So flexibility and resilience are our key sort of watchwords in managing overall program risk. Okay, that's implicit. It's implicit because it's internal to the way the program is structured and managed. Explicit program risk management is something that you'll be much more familiar with. This is a way that we address individual risks within the program. Not the risk of the overall program itself, but risks that arise within the program, whether they come up from below, down from above, or at us from the same program level. And here we've just got a simple risk management process, which is similar to the project risk management process. Phew, at last, something familiar. So we've got our kickoff step, our process initiation or risk management planning, identify, analyze, plan our responses and implement, review, update, and finally learn the lessons. We can do that simple process at the program level as well, but it only works for individual risks. So this is about identifying individual risks, prioritizing individual risks, and developing and implementing responses for them. This is not the way that we structure the deal with the whole thing. These are individually targeted actions against individual risks in a way that we're much more familiar with, from the project arena. So similar tools and techniques apply here to the sorts of things that we'll use at the project level. And the two things relate together. So the idea is that at implicit level, we're making decisions about the structure, scope, content, and context of the program in order to address the overall risk exposure of the whole thing. And then at explicit level, once we've done that, then we have a whole set of risk process steps which manage the individual risks within the program once we've set the overall exposure in terms of the way we've structured the program. Okay? So that's the idea, that we've got a kind of a two-phase risk management approach: implicit, explicit. Implicit first in terms of the way we structure the program, explicit once we've done that to manage the risks that we've now baked into our program. That's the theory, and that's what sort of best practice program managers and program risk managers are working towards. The question, there are a number of issues that remain if we're going to make this work in practice. And so this is really where I'd like to sort of leave it to you as the practitioners. I'm also a practitioner, but for those of us who are active in the field, we've got to make this work somehow. It's clear that there are these risks that come at us from different directions. They're all important, and we need to do something about them. It's clear that the overall risk exposure of the program needs to be managed in a way that's different from the individual risks that we identify as we go along. The question is how. And I think there are some issues for us to think about. One is this question of risk efficiency. So risk efficiency is a fairly clear principle. We want to maximize the level of return for a given level of risk, or we want to minimize the level of risk for a required level of return. It sounds easy, so how do we do that? So how do we measure risk and return, for example? How do we get a consistent scale across our portfolio, across our components within our program? And what is the risk-efficient frontier for our organization? Where is too much risk? Where is not enough reward? That will be different for different organizations. Do we even understand the question? And do we know how to answer it? There are some real things here. Microsoft Project has a button called Risk Efficiency. It's garbage. Please, I'm sorry, am I being recorded? This is not this. You know, what Microsoft Project calls Risk Efficiency is something different completely. So don't think you can do this by pressing the button. One of the things that's really important at program level is to stop thinking like project managers. Project managers have a very big challenge. You know, it's a difficult task. We have to deliver deliverables within a set of constraints. You know, don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we've not got enough resources. With customers who keep changing their mind and conflicting requirements, all of those sorts of, it's really tough to deliver projects, and we've got to deliver our deliverables on time, on budget, full scope. But that's not the program challenge. The program challenge is at a different level. It's about strategy. And so we've got to recognize that to address risk at program level, we need to think differently. Think like program managers, don't think like project managers. And this is a real challenge for us, I think. Most people who come to program management come at it from the project level. The other thing that's interesting to just drop in here, and we won't have time to explore this now, I'm just wrapping up, is that there are different types of programs. So we have mega programs, which are single unitary things that just create strategic value. We have programs which are, we call them heartbeat programs, so they deliver something and then they go back into a kind of development phase, and then they deliver something and then they're back into then they deliver, and they go into that sort of pulse mode. There are programs which are just simple groups of parallel projects that are managed together because they have similarities. And each of these different program types, whether it's a parallel project program, a heartbeat program, or a mega program, they have different levels of risk exposure, and they need a slightly different approach. How do we tailor this program risk management implicit, explicit thing for different program types? How do we interface the risk part with the wider program management? Clearly, we're talking particularly in implicit risk management. We're talking about managing the risk, managing the program overall. And we need to make sure there's a clear interface between the risk management piece and the overall program management piece. So just to summarize with the thing that I said right near the beginning, the point here is that programs are different from projects. And that's important. Programs are risky, that's a good thing, because then that gives us the opportunity to do something different and creative and innovative, and that risk needs to be managed. But the problem is that program risk management is not the same as project risk management that we're familiar with. I suggest that using this flipping implicit, explicit, pulsing two-stage risk management approach is the way for us to address the particular challenges of managing risk at program level, and I recommend that you give it a try. So that's the end of the presentation. I think I've left some time for questions. If you go to the Risk Doctor website, there are some papers on this topic. Go to the publications area and just put program into the search box. There are videos, free videos, webinars. I didn't do that. Did somebody else do that from the back? Okay, that's very odd. Perhaps it's time to stop. It wasn't me. You can also raise questions. There's a contact page where you can ask questions directly through the website. But that's the end of the formal part of the presentation. I'm happy to take some questions. Let's go. Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, we first tried it on NASA with the mission to Mars, and obviously that's a sort of a mega project, or a mega program rather, and that's where some of these concepts were developed. We've used it with a mining company in South Africa, which has a whole portfolio of programs. Used it in Victoria. In Australia, in terms of water risk for the government, for the state government, thinking about floods, droughts and fires. It's been used, yes, it's quite widely used.
What sort of risks did you identify differently than those that you would have used on the traditional?
Sure. Some of the risks are traditional project risks which are sufficiently big that they're escalated and aggregated, so you'd be familiar with those. Things to do with common points of failure across all the projects, for example, and you aggregate them together. Each individual project can cope with them on their own, but when you put them together, it requires program level attention, and things that just have huge impacts if they occur. So that's the sort of traditional level. Changes in policy from the top, where we decide to change our product mix. We're not going to work in this country anymore, for example. That's actually affected programs coming down from the strategic level. And then, as I mentioned, at the program level, we've got issues to do with interfaces and sort of relative prioritization. And as those change, they affect the risk exposure of the program. So they are sort of specific to the program, really.
And so in the program level, you have a program-specific workshop, risk workshop, I guess.
Yes, yeah.
Analyse how things feel.
Yeah, I mean, some of the techniques, so you can use the sort of standard workshop approach. You can brainstorming checklists, SWOT analysis, force field analysis, failure modes, all those sort of standard techniques, yes. Yeah. Yes, sir?
I'm trying not to ask a project management question, but from implicit risks, how do you actually financially provision for them? And what I mean is the problems we have with enterprise risk management,
Mm-hmm.
Where we pull the money, or did it come from the top down or the bottom up?
Yes.
How can you actually enact this? Would you provision the budget if you're going to do something about it?
Yeah. It is a project question, isn't it? I mean, it's the same question at project level and at overall portfolio level and at sort of corporate level. And the question is, how do you know you've got enough contingency? And the answer is you don't. So there's two things you can do. There's the bottom-up approach of looking at your individual risks and doing a full risk assessment of your baseline case, so we know how much risk we expect, and having a risk budget against our known unknowns. And then for the unknown unknowns, which are the emergent things that tend to come at us from program level, then we need to be looking at past performance. So then you've just got to go to the lessons learned from similar previous programs and say, we needed 8%, 12%, 20%, and just learn from experience. There is no golden bullet, I'm afraid. Do we have one more question, maybe? Yes, please.
Do you collate all these projects into a program using a single unified software like ProjectControlsExpo?
For the risk assessment, you mean? Any of the major risk tools will enable you to collate your risk information at project level into program level, and then program level into portfolio. So yes, PertMaster, PRA with Oracle, yes, Predict, yes, even at risk, Risk Plus, there's the Deltek tool, Acumen, they'll all do it. And then the big one is Active Risk Manager, which is quite expensive, but is the kind of gold standard for doing that level of portfolio risk assessment. Yeah. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions over coffee.